And can you tell me why is it that you don't want to be here today?
Well, I object to that.
Or
That's not
what
relevant.
grounds, Your Honor?
Oh, you may answer the question.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm humiliated to be here. This is a horrible experience, and I'm fearful of my brother.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. So many of you may be wondering why there was no video feed for yesterday's witnesses. And there were a couple of witnesses, there were a couple of neighbors of Susan's and also a couple of neighbors of Kathie Durst. I'm not going to deal with any of those except to sort of summarize that the neighbor of Kathie, I think it's Anne Doyle, she said that Kathie was terrified of Robert Durst, right? And that is the same thing that his younger brother by 7 years, Thomas Durst, said about his brother as well. So there were two headlines that sort of came out shortly after the testimony, both from the New York Post, both saying the same thing, that various people were terrified of Robert Durst, right? It doesn't seem to really make sense because you see this old, feeble man, but that is what makes this trial so unique, is we're really going back across vast swathes of time, you know, kind of as far back as almost 50 years. Going back to, for example, around about 1970. And that's quite rare in true crime. Usually one goes back 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years at the most. This is a lifetime of possible criminality and all that kind of thing. So in this episode, I'm not going to talk about the neighbors, except, as I say, just to emphasize that Anne Doyle noticed how Kathie would be often terrified of her husband, right? And instead I'm going to just focus on Thomas Durst, the younger brother. Now, a couple of interesting things to highlight. Thomas Durst really didn't want to testify. You kind of get a sense of, if not eccentricity, then idiosyncrasy from Thomas. In other words, you kind of get that same aspect where you look at Robert Durst and you think, wow, this is an interesting character. You get something like that in the younger brother, who has certain traits, like he can remember dates quite well, right? He's also quite a stubborn gentleman in the sense of he admits that he really objected to being on trial, in the trial, and he only came because he was subpoenaed. He really didn't want to be involved. He feels humiliated by being, I guess, associated with his brother. But if the question is, why was there no video from this particular day? Well, you can kind of imagine that Thomas Durst, for example, would have felt humiliated enough by being in court, but it would probably be too much for him to have his testimony recorded and streamed, and, you know, photos of himself out there as well. And so it's probably as a result of his objections, probably also his brother's, Douglas, who's still got to testify, that all of this was decided. It may also be why Robert Durst is going to testify. I've sat in on a couple of court cases where the defendants testify, but also on condition that there is no media streaming of their testimony. For example, Oscar Pistorius, he didn't want to be seen, and some of the witnesses in the Henry Van Breda case also didn't want to be seen. So that does happen. In this case, we are not going to have any video of the court proceedings besides the opening, which is already passed, and then I think also the verdict and sentencing. So kind of the broad bulk of the court case, which they say may last as much as 5 months, we are not going to see, but we will be able to hear. And so in this sense, we are really going to have to rely on the journalist to tell us things about, for example, Robert Durst's appearance, his demeanor, how he's dressed, what he's doing. And in the Patrick Frazee case, I know the journalist covering that did an exceptional job just describing little things that you would otherwise have just seen in a feed. And you had certain journalists who were up to that, who were obviously watching things like hawks and catching little moments and capturing little moments, whereas others would just sort of provide dry summaries of the day's events. I know when I've sat in court, I also try and get the narrative beyond the dry reporting of it. So, what does the defendant do each day? Who does he look at? Who does he talk to? How is he dressed? What changes in terms of that? Who are the sort of regular folks that are attached to him in court each day? What is really going on? And how do those behavior patterns change, if at all? When does he laugh? When does he look emotional? All those kinds of things. Now, the impression we get of Robert Durst, the man, from these neighbors and from his brother, is of a mean, selfish, and intimidating persona. Someone who is capable of being really nasty, including to the people closest to him. And it sounds as if he had quite a mean mouth on him, that he would really belittle and demean people. And so we can imagine how Robert Durst and Morris Black, who was also a cantankerous guy, we can imagine how they got along, or rather didn't get along. And then from that verbal abuse, the question is, well, was Robert Durst capable of physical violence? And so you had the one neighbor kind of confirming that did appear to be the case. So I'm going to just take you quickly through the highlights of Thomas Durst's testimony. He's the youngest brother, and what's quite interesting with Thomas Durst is, if you think about Robert Durst, he's kind of totally estranged from his family. He is being accused of murdering his closest friend in Susan Berman and other things, but his youngest brother is also estranged from his entire family. That's something that also came up. So you kind of get the sense that what happened to this family? And if you're not quite sure what the fascination is of the Durst case, you might be saying to yourself, I don't really get it. What's the big deal about this old geezer? Why are we paying any attention to this old dude, right? He maybe he did something, but who really cares? If you're familiar with the trajectory of Durst's story, that whole roller coaster ride over many years, it is a crazy, rollicking story. I mean, even certain elements of it would sort of make a movie. So just the murder of Morris Black, his neighbor, or the killing of Morris Black, that would be an epic true crime story on its own. And of course, then there's the fugitive flight, and apparently the attempt to try and get hold of his younger brother Douglas, and all that kind of thing. But it just goes on and on and on. And so it's a very long saga And again, you might say, well, so what? But the thing is, this is the heir to $1 billion fortune. And somehow one gets the idea that Durst himself is responsible for kind of spurning his fortune, if that makes sense. In other words, he was so entitled and so arrogant that his own family, that he sort of turned his own family against him. I mean, if he just behaved in a reasonable way, the world was his oyster and he would have inherited things the way that was expected. But he was such a objectionable human being, urinating in someone's garbage, incredibly objectionable, belching at meetings, I guess farting as well, just walking around as if he owned the world, I guess, and I don't think he expected to be denied what he expected, what he felt he was entitled to. And so through Robert Durst, we kind of get a bird's eye view into what can happen when you have kind of a paradise setting where you can have the world at your feet, and then a bad attitude can really mess all of that up, where you feel you can control other people, you can do what you like to everybody else and get away with it. And that is the part that's sort of fascinating. The other part that's fascinating is what Robert Durst has thus far gotten away with. And the question I think haunting this case is, he was acquitted in the previous court case, where he was charged with the murder of Morris Black. What's going to happen in this one? Is he going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, or is Durst finally going to face his comeuppance? And that is the fascinating and terrifying aspect to great wealth. In the Durst story, it's kind of a scenario of, with great wealth comes great irresponsibility. And the other aspect that makes the story fascinating is there is the sense, there's an impression that there were conspiracies of silence, that there was a craven silence where people close to Durst or friends of his or possibly even family kept his secrets. And you might say, why? Well, because they stood to gain by staying on his side. They could potentially be in the money, and by going against him, they faced obviously unknown acrimonious damage. And one example of that possibly was Kathie Durst. Did Kathie Durst oppose him, and what happened to her? And so she would kind of, if that is what happened, she would or she could serve as a possible lesson to everybody else. If you go against me, if you back me into a corner, if you don't listen to what I say, ... And I think the other side to this that makes it fascinating is how someone can take all that privilege and wealth and resources and do what with it? What did Robert Durst end up doing with it? It seems like he just ended up becoming bitter and resentful. On the other hand, one could argue that he did have a wild ride, certainly in certain sections of his life where he partied in kind of a counterculture community with, for example, John Lennon and Yoko Ono. He kind of indulged in the hippie culture. He was really a product of the 60s. And although he went to university, not much really happened there except kind of on the sidelines, him dabbling in marijuana, getting involved in scream therapy also with John Lennon, and that whole kind of world. It may be that because the Durst children grew up without their mother either committed suicide or fell off a roof, But that happened when all the children were quite young, and that may have intensified negative feelings and brought out the worst in the children and broke the family apart earlier than it otherwise would have or could have. Mothers often are the glue that hold families together, and Bernice's death probably was a key thing that basically allowed cracks to form, and then ultimately allowed really the Durst family to break apart. So the quite well-known, almost iconic photo of the Durst children, there are 4 children on the carpet in their home in Scarsdale, New York. On the far left is Thomas, standing and holding that sort of blueprint of the skyscraper is Robert Durst. Sitting in front of him with a striped shirt is Douglas, and then Wendy Durst is on the side, their sister. You kind of get an inkling of the privileged life these kids lived, first of all through that particular image, but then also when Durst is asked about when Thomas Durst is asked about his relationship with Robert, he starts saying, "I was locked in my room by my governess." So, he had a governess. Not everybody does. And anyway, he basically says, we didn't have a relationship. And one must kind of wonder why. Why is that? What and who did Durst have a relationship with, if not with his siblings? And I think the answer is with kind of the hippie culture and with, to some extent, substances. If that's not the answer, what is the answer? Thomas Durst did say that there was a time in 1970 when they both tried to become closer. They tried to be friends, but it didn't last. I don't know whether that date is accurate, if it's 1970 but actually 1971, but one possible motive or one possible reason why Robert tried to fix his relationship with his brother was because that was around the time that he met Kathie McCormick, a dental hygienist who would become his wife, Kathie Durst. And there is a little bit of interaction between Thomas and Kathie. And so one can sort of anticipate that if Robert wanted to woo this much younger woman, he would want her to think that things were all good and well with his siblings and with his family, right? So Robert Durst married Kathie McCormack on his 30th birthday in April 1973. At that stage, Thomas would have been 23 years old. What's also interesting is that Robert Durst and his younger brother, so obviously Thomas is the youngest brother, but Douglas is the younger brother, they actually had counseling for sibling rivalry. So there was real animosity between the eldest brother and the younger brother. And so if Thomas has this feeling of estrangement and discomfort and dismay and maybe even disgust at being humiliated by his brother, one can only imagine what it is for his other siblings, especially Douglas. And Douglas is still going to testify, and so is Robert. So it's interesting that Thomas Durst has no relationships with any of his family. So obviously he's an older guy. His parents have both died, and he doesn't have a relationship with Robert, which is kind of understandable, but it's quite sad that he doesn't have a relationship with Douglas or Wendy either. And he basically testified that when his father Seymour passed away in 1995, the Durst children, all four of them, kind of felt that they had nothing in common. And so he says, I decided to separate from my family. So after his family died, in other words, for the past 25 years, he's sort of been estranged essentially from his siblings. When the Deputy District Attorney John Lewin asked Thomas, on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being the cheapest person you know and 100 being the most generous, where would you rank Robert Durst? And then there was an objection to that, but when Thomas Durst eventually answered, he said about -50 if the scale goes that low. So there's clearly no love lost there. There's clearly kind of a sense that Robert is extremely miserly and in a way that Thomas doesn't approve of. When asked to give an example of how cheap Durst is, Thomas said that Bob once came to his house with Kathie, and this is why I say this was during the time when he was trying to, not so much him, but Robert was trying to kind of get him, to play along with the appearance that he's a nice guy, which is he? I mean, is Robert Durst a nice guy? In any event, it was during this time that he came to Thomas's home with Kathie, and he found out that Kathie was living kind of on food stamps. And he said he went to the store with Kathie and she needed feminine products, but she couldn't buy them with food stamps. And so Thomas eventually paid for that. Just kind of gives you an idea of what a unreasonable and tight-fisted person Durst is, doesn't it? Thomas only has glowing praise for Kathie, Durst's wife. He said she was a wonderful person, also ambitious, caring, and he described her as a lovely person. And then you kind of get this more erratic side to Robert Durst coming from Thomas. And one wonders whether is this part of his personality, is it part of kind of a drug-fueled personality, what is going on. But he talks about in December 1981, so this is really 11 years into the marriage, I think about a year before her murder. Well, really just months before her disappearance. Specifically 1 month before her disappearance. She disappeared on January the 31st, 1982. And this was an incident that happened December 1981, so 1 to 2 months prior to that. Thomas was invited to Robert Durst's penthouse apartment for dinner, and it's not clear whether it was close to Christmas or whatever. Obviously, I'm not sure if they would have practiced Christmas anyway. In any event, he rang the bell. Kathie came to the door wearing a sexy nightgown. Bob walked up behind her and lifted her gown. And Kathie shouted at him, Robert, and Thomas then just turned around and left. So you can kind of tell from that Thomas was in the picture, but sort of barely. There wasn't a strong relationship, otherwise he probably would have stayed and dealt with it. But it also shows to what extent Thomas said that the way that Bob, what he did to Kathie, lifting a nightgown twice, was him showing his power over her. And then finally, and I'm going to kind of wrap up here, Thomas said he had a serious confrontation with Bob in 1982 after Kathie went missing. And Robert said to Thomas, I know she asked you for money. And obviously Durst was kind of thinking, the way I'm going to control Kathie is through money. If she's reliant on money from me, and bear in mind at this point she was at medical school, then I can control her, right? And there's a lot more to it. There's the fact that Robert Durst was cheating on his wife, but she couldn't cheat on him. That's actually mentioned in the jinx. In any event, Robert said, I know she asked you for money to Thomas. And Thomas actually yells this out in court at the top of his lungs, imitating how Bob apparently did it. And I'm going to play that for you now. But I'm also going to just wrap up this episode just to let you know that the next episode on this channel will be Chris Watts, What Else Do We Know? Episode 20 in the series. If you're interested in additional coverage on the Durst trial, I'm also writing a book on it called Entitlement. I plan to bring out the first book in a series of shortish books before the midway point of the trial, and then a second and possibly even a third book later on in the trial. So I want to try and bring the book out as close as possible to the real-time coverage, just to make sure that I'm staying current with what is going on, but also to provide you with a cogent narrative. We're bringing and highlighting all the most important information in a way that's cohesive and clear. So look out for that. I will obviously let you know when the book comes out, but it might be sometime in April. So if you're interested in that and the coverage of this case from True Crime Rocket Science, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.
During this same trip, did you have a confrontation with your brother Bob?
I had a serious confrontation with him, but it happened in 1982 on a trip in April.
Can you describe what that confrontation was about?
Yes, it was about Kathie. Now, as you know, Kathie was missing by that time. I use the term missing. And Robert Durst came up to me, and these are the words he said. He said it, I know she asked you for money, but that's not the meaning that he put on it. He said it like this: I know she asked you for money!
So for the record, to capture, this is a very angry tone that the witness used when he stated those words. He shouted those words in an angry tone.
Mr. Durst, when he said that, how did you take that?
I felt like I was about to die.
What's the next thing that happened?
I tried to be with my father for breakfast, and Bob joined us. Breakfast ends, and we walk towards the Durst organization. I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to walk with them to the Durst organization. And Bob must have noticed my father liked to walk through office buildings, even ones he didn't own, although he owned a lot. And so we come to these revolving doors. And I don't know how revolving doors work. It never occurred to me that there was something special about revolving doors. But evidently, each door section has a brake. And it's a rubber or cloth thing that rubs against the glass and slows the progress. So Seymour goes through the revolving door first. Then I go into the revolving door. And from behind, like a sneak, he takes his full strength, and you can't think of him this way. He was strong in those days. He took his full strength, and he shoved the glass, and I went around and around, and I fell out. Oh my God. I fell out on the street, on my knees, and he's guffawing. It's the funniest thing he's ever seen in his entire life. An elderly gentleman had gotten into the revolving door after me, and he also ended up on the floor, but he was on the floor inside the building, and he's shouting, idiots, idiots, like I had something to do with this. Bob is guffawing, Seymour is his usual self, walking away. Who are these people? I don't know. And I'm listening to my brother laughing. He's just holding his gut. It is so funny.
How did you find out that Kathie had disappeared?
I don't have exact memory. I got a phone call from my sister Wendy. There had been a Durst organization meeting, and that's where the cousins got to come together around a big table and eat sandwiches. Sometimes I would phone in and listen to them eat sandwiches. Wendy called me after the meeting and said, Bob is in muddy boots. The Durst organization.
Let me stop you.
Sorry?
No, I'm asking you. Motion to strike the last part of the answer.
It's stricken, it's not responsive.
Sorry.
Jury's to disregard it.
You can't, just listen to my question. So, you found out from your sister, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so you find out that she's disappeared, that Kathie is missing. Were you involved at all in anything having to do with the investigation?
No.
Did you have any conversations with your brother Bob about her disappearance at that time?
He called me a village gossip, so I knew not to ask any questions.
Were you ever interviewed by any police agents, any investigators?
Not until 2003.
I want to ask you for a moment about, by the way, during your interactions with Kathie, did she appear to be excited about becoming a doctor?
Very.
Did she give you any indication that she was ready to abandon her life as she knew it and voluntarily disappear?
She was looking forward to being a pediatrician.
I want to ask for a moment, when I say the name Susan Berman, is that someone that you know?
I met her once,
And when did you meet her approximately?
1975.
And can you tell me the circumstances of how and where you met her?
Bob had arrived at my apartment and needed a ride to her apartment. I drove him there. I went inside. She was living on Clay Street.
And this is in San Francisco, correct?
Correct.
And did you have a chance to see Susan and Bob interact?
Yes.
Can you describe how Susan treated Bob?
She treated him like she was seeing a new baby. She loved Bob.
Other than that, did you have any interaction with Susan?
She showed me her bookcase. It was a big, beautiful bookcase with one book, her book.
And did you have any further interaction with her after that?
I never saw her again, but I read her pieces.
And how did you find out that she'd been murdered?
I was buying bagels in a town called San Anselmo. That's the suburb. And the San Francisco Chronicle was for sale, and there was a headline that Susan Berman, who had worked at the Chronicle and other news outlets in San Francisco, was dead.
And by your memory, did this occur right after she was murdered, or was this something that was done a little bit later?
Yes, the newspaper stories came about 2 weeks after her death.
Can you tell me, when's the last time that you spoke to your brother, to Bob?
I hung up the phone on him in 1990.
When's the last time you saw him in person?
I saw him, I was in a room with him, not by my choice, but the last time I spoke to him was 1986.
As you sit here, Mr. Durst, and you've given your testimony, has this been a difficult place for you to be in the presence of your brother?
Yes, it is.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.